Good day. Today, Wednesday, 20th March, we continue to get reports of potential French military deployments to Ukraine, despite the statements from President Macron of France that France is not at the moment intending to deploy troops to Ukraine. There's been a claim from Sergei Narishkin, who heads the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. It's equivalent to the British Secret Service, Russia's premier spy agency. Anyway, Narishkin has said that the French have a plan to send 2,000 troops to Ukraine. And this has elicited a strong denial from the French Defense Ministry. They said that no such plan for the moment exists. But even as the French Defense Ministry denies this plan, we get reports that French military officials or ex-French military officials are going on French television discussing and speculating that plans to deploy French troops to Ukraine exist, and there's all sorts of far-fetched plans to deploy 20,000 men along Ukraine's northern border to act as a tripwire, a red line preventing the Russians advancing across that border, releasing Ukrainian troops so that they can fight and presumably die for Ukraine in Donbass, and other stories that the French are going to establish some kind of sanctuary in Odessa, and all kinds of stories of that kind continue to circulate. Now, before I proceed to discuss all that, there's been another waspish statement from Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia, former prime minister of Russia, now deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and head of its Military Industrial Commission. And his point about French military deployments to Ukraine is bring it on. And some of his comments, really quite interesting. He says, actually, for the success of our cause, it would be nice if the restless French dispatched a couple of regiments to Banderaland. He means, of course, Ukraine. It would be very problematic to hide such a number of servicemen, so systematically eliminating them would not be the most difficult task, but surely the most important one. But just think of the beneficial knock-on effects. There will be no chance of getting away with various lame excuses and speculations that mercenaries choose their own fate and that they're risking their lives at their own discretion. As for the Gallic roosters in the French leadership, he is, of course, referring here principally to Macron, it would be tantamount to being guillotined. They would be torn to pieces by the enraged relatives and angry members of the opposition who have been assured all along that France is not at war with Russia. And it would be a good lesson for other rambunctious fools in Europe. And then Medvedev finishes off with a poem by Pushkin, which is all about, please do send your troops to Russia's plains, and they will be sent to a room to slumber. Anyway, that's from Medvedev. Basically, bring it on. By the way, in this, I suspect he's not that far from the sentiments of at least some Russian soldiers. I think that by now in the war, the Russians feel very confident that they can take on and deal with any conventional force that the French at least could put together, or indeed any other European power could cobble together. And I think that given overall feeling in Russia at the present time, it's highly likely that Russian soldiers would actually be itching at least some of them would be, I don't want to generalize, but some of them would be itching to finally come to grips with troops from NATO on the territory of Ukraine. I say all of that, let me repeat again, I find this whole idea of sending NATO troops into Ukraine completely misconceived, entirely misguided, and incredibly dangerous. And I think most of the world thinks the same. I've no doubt that the Russians would indeed, as they like to say, tear the French to pieces. It's not because the French soldiers aren't highly trained. It's not because some French officers aren't extremely capable. It is because France lacks the weight of military force to make a difference in the battlefronts in Ukraine and cannot match the Russian army. Alex Vashinin's article in the Royal United Services Institute, which I discussed yesterday, essentially explains why. And I personally think that Medvedev is absolutely right. If French troops were indeed sent to Ukraine and were indeed starting to suffer significant casualties, then I personally do think that there would be a very considerable backlash in France, and very quickly. So I think this is an incredibly reckless and stupid gamble. And I also have to say, if it is ever carried out, I think that the United States would be extremely unhappy, wondering whether they're being pushed into a situation where they're going to be asked to rescue the French and the Europeans from whatever adventure they get themselves involved in Ukraine. And in that event, we are well on the way. If the Americans do respond and respond positively to that, we are well on the way towards potential apocalyptic outcomes, leading us all the way to World War III and to the use of nuclear weapons. I've discussed all of this at painstaking length in earlier programs. Given the extraordinary risks of escalation, I still believe that despite all the sound and fury that we're getting from France, this isn't actually going to happen. And I think that Narishkin's comment about the French sending 2,000 troops to Ukraine, which the French, of course, have now denied, I suspect that it's intended to stir the pot, to increase alarm and concern in France ahead of the European elections, where Macron's party is expected to do badly, rather than, in fact, that it's actually based on real intelligence. Though, I may be wrong, and it may be the more reckless plans are indeed being hatched. On the subject of the Americans intervening in Ukraine to rescue the Europeans, I'm going to go back to a discussion that I reported on some days ago between various members of the Duran community who've separately been sending emails to me. One of them spoke about the enormous air superiority that NATO would have over Russia in any conflict in Ukraine. Another member of the Duran community who has an Air Force background, I'm not going to say in which Air Force, responded that this is wrong and that, in fact, the first person who had contacted me was overestimating both the strength of the air forces that NATO would be able to commit to the fight in Ukraine and was underestimating the strength and power both of the Russian Air Force and of the Russian air defense system. And anyway, that second commentator, who, as I said, has an Air Force background, has now emailed me again and has provided me with information which suggests that at any one time, only around a third of the F-35 stealth fighter fleet, and in fact, I think that also encompasses the F-22s, only a third of the US stealth fighters are in a combat-capable condition. And I have to say also that if the United States were to run a risk of losing large numbers of stealth fighters in a battle over in Ukraine, I think that given how expensive these aircraft are and how necessary they are, or at least how necessary the United States believes them to be in terms of a conflict in the Asia Pacific, where China is now busily increasing its fleet of stealth fighters, I think that as well would act as a deterrent to the kind of aerial campaign that we were discussing a few days ago. But anyway, I don't really feel comfortable about discussing these catastrophic scenarios. When I say that I think that the deployment of French troops in Ukraine is unlikely on any scale, I admit that I'm partly perhaps saying this because it is more the wish. It is partly my wish, it is partly my hope, and the wish may be the father to the thought, as is said. In other words, because I want something not to happen, I believe that it won't happen. With a personality as volatile and as vain as Macron, I'm afraid one can never be entirely sure. But either way, the Russians are waiting, and it is not affecting their operations on the Ukrainian battlefields. And I think I'm now going to turn to those because the last 24 hours, the 24 hours since confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry of the capture of Orlovka in the Avdiivka area, they all suggest that the situation is now becoming, again, even worse for the Ukrainians in the Avdiivka area sector. Now, there's a lot of discussions about this. The Ukrainians appear, as I understand it, to have confirmed that they have retreated from Orlovka. I haven't seen myself the confirmation of this, but those are the reports. As always happens, there are some Russian bloggers who, despite the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry says that Orlovka has, as the Russian Defense Ministry likes to say, been liberated, insist that the Ukrainians still are in control of some small part of Orlovka. This is, by the way, a recurring thing. There are Russian bloggers who always seem to go out of their way to take the most pessimistic from a Russian point of view, of the actual progress of the Russian military in the fighting in Ukraine. It's almost as if they take a pleasure in doing so. For the record, my own view is that if the Russian Defense Ministry say that Orlovka has been captured, then it has been. And I don't personally see any reason to doubt this. And as I said, I understand that the Ukrainians themselves are acknowledging as much. Anyway, just as there are some Russian bloggers who want to take a pessimistic view, there are other Russian bloggers who want to take an optimistic view. There are some Russian bloggers who are saying that Tonenka has completely fallen under Russian control. I think it's very likely, but the Russian Defense Ministry has not confirmed it. But perhaps more importantly, there's also been lots of reports that the Russians are now clearing the fields of Ukrainian troops between Orlovka and Tonenka, and perhaps even more importantly, between Orlovka and Berdichi, and Berdichi being the village further north, where, by the way, the most intense fighting has taken place. On the topic of Berdici, I would say that there were various reports way back in October, at the time when the Russians first started the Avdiivka operation, claiming that the Russians had actually captured Berdici then. And of course, those reports were clearly wrong. And I wonder whether they were the product of hyper-optimism on the part of Russian bloggers, or perhaps attempts by Ukrainian officials and people running Ukraine's media campaign to spread stories of Russian advances, knowing that they were untrue, so that they could be refuted later, and so that the Russians might be seen to have made less progress than had been initially reported, which would then lend force to a narrative that was circulating quite widely, as I remember, in October, that the entire Avdiivka operation being carried out by the Russians was going horribly wrong. If you remember, there were all kinds of claims that the Russians had launched attacks, that thousands of Russian troops had been killed, hundreds of Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armored vehicles had been destroyed, that the first attacks by the Russians in the Avdiivka area had been repulsed and had gone disastrously wrong. There were lots of reports of that kind, and they were circulating all over the Western media for weeks, and for a long time, those reports coloured Western understanding of the battle for Avdiivka, and continued to do so right up to the moment when suddenly confirmation came that Avdiivka had actually been captured by the Russians. So, a lot of this goes on, and it makes it very difficult for someone like me, who, to repeat again, I'm not on the front lines myself. I don't know what exactly is going on there. And also, I don't have direct access to what Russian troops are saying. I can only get information at second and third hand from Telegram channels and such things. Anyway, it makes it difficult sometimes for people like me to know exactly what is going on. But suffice to say that the most reliable reports that I see suggest that Tonenka likely has indeed been captured by the Russians, that the Russians have largely captured, or perhaps entirely captured, the fields between Tonenka and Orlovka further north, and are well on way to capturing the fields between Orlovka and Berdici. The Ukrainians still have a presence in Berdici. Fighting continues to take place there, but with the Russians having captured Orlovka and the fields to the south of Berdici probably before long, it seems to me that the fall of Berdici is now only a matter of time. Now, perhaps taking a cue from my video of yesterday, but maybe not, there's been a lot of discussion about what the Russians intend to do once they've completed the capture of these three villages, Orlovka, Tonenka, and Berdici. There is a kind of fragile Ukrainian defense line further west along a water barrier. Apparently it is in low-lying territory. It would not be particularly difficult to breach, and it's been suggested that the way to breach it, and the most likely way that the Russians would take if they chose to breach it, would be to advance north towards the village of Ocheretino along the railway to the northwest of Avdiivka, and to take Ocheretino, which is on higher ground, which supposedly would enable the Russians to basically control the higher ground in this area. Now, I think that the Russians probably do have a plan to capture Ocheretino, but as I discussed in my program yesterday, I think the Russian priority is to finish the Battle of Pervomaisky, which is to the south, small town, 28,000 people to the south of southwest of Avdiivka. There's been intense fighting for this particular town for some time. I think if the Russians gain control of the territory north of Pervomaisky, having recently captured the village of Nivolskoye to the south of Pervomaisky, and having advanced through Pervomaisky from the east, well, they would have Pervomaisky, the remaining territory in Pervomaisky, under Ukrainian control in a semicircle. And as we saw in the Battle of Avdiivka, with the town in a semicircle and the roads leading into it being blocked, it's likely that Pervomaisky would in that case quickly fall. And given that we must be close to the point where the Russians will gain control of the territory to the north of Pervomaisky, it's probably something that's going to happen within a week or so, if it's correct that Tonenka has already fallen, and it probably is. Well, then it's likely that we are looking at the start of the end of the Battle of Pervomaisky within the next few weeks, assuming, of course, that the Russians make that their priority, as I expect they will. And control of Nivolskoye also gives the Russians access to various supply routes into Krasnogorovka. Reports this morning that the Russians have actually started an advance from Nivolskoye towards one of these supply roads, cutting off supplies, or at least one of the supply routes into Krasnogorovka. This other town, around 14,000 people further south, that the Russians have been attacking for several weeks now. The Russians have also apparently been gaining control of areas in the fields to the east of Krasnogorovka. It looks likely that, again, before long, especially after Pervomaisky falls, this area, this town of Krasnogorovka, will also be taken into a semicircle with the supply roads either cut or dangerous to any road traffic. And at that point, Krasnogorovka presumably will also fall. And as I discussed yesterday, capture of Pervomaisky, capture of Krasnogorovka, then opens the way for the capture of Kurakovo. And on the topic of the capture of Kurakovo, the Russians seem to be working towards advancing towards Kurakovo from the northeast, in other words, from Pervomaisky, once that's captured, and towards Kurakovo from the east, once Krasnogorovka has been captured. But they're also pushing towards Kurakovo from the southeast through Georgievka and the other village, whose name I can't remember, between Georgievka and Kurakovo. And on that topic, by the way, yesterday reports were circulating, in fact they weren't circulating, they have now been conclusively confirmed that an entire platoon of Ukrainian troops, 18 men, surrendered en masse to the Russians in this village of Georgievka. The story apparently is that they were ordered by the Ukrainian command to go to Georgievka to contain the Russian advance through that village. These troops then moved into Georgievka under heavy drone and artillery attack. When they arrived at the place where the other Ukrainian troops who they were supposed to reinforce in Georgievka were supposed to be, they found that there were no other Ukrainian troops in that place in Georgievka. They then realized that the Russians were on the move in overwhelming force, and they decided that rather than lay down their lives in a fruitless cause, they contacted the Russians and offered to surrender en masse, which offer was accepted. And there are even reports that these soldiers, perhaps fearing punishment if they're ever returned to Ukraine, have asked the Russians not to exchange them, not to send them back to Ukraine as part of any future prisoner of war exchange. So, a mass surrender of a platoon of troops in Pervomaisky. I don't think we should make over much of this story, by the way. It's interesting, and it perhaps suggests that Ukrainian defences in Georgievka, a mass surrender of Ukrainian troops in Georgievka. It suggests that Ukrainian defences in Georgievka are now collapsing, and I think that is almost certainly the case. But in terms of the Ukrainian army as a whole, there was an uptick of surrenders by Ukrainian troops a couple of weeks ago. Then we got few reports about this over the last few weeks. I suspect that Syrskyi, when he was appointed overall commander of the Ukrainian forces, military commander, tightened things up and made sure that opportunities for mass surrenders of this kind diminished. The fact that a single platoon has surrendered is interesting in terms of what is happening in one particular case, in this case Georgievka. But to stress again, it does not seem to be the general pattern so far across the Ukrainian army. But anyway, it looks as if the Russians are making more progress towards Georgievka and through Georgievka, and that also opens up the way for an attack on Kurachovo, probably at some point in the next few months. And as I've said, once Kurachovo is captured, Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar start to crumble as well. The supply lines to Vuhledar start to break down. Now, if one actually looks at a map, always a dangerous thing for me to do, by the way, as I've said many times, I'm not the best person looking at maps. But if one looks at a map, a number of things then begin to become clear, which is that if the Russians capture Kurachovo, and if they then subsequently resume their advance further north towards Pokrovsk, then they come into a strong position to take places like Pavlograd, further west, and then if they capture Pavlograd, they are close to the Dnieper River, opposite where Dnipro is, and of course, if they also capture Pokrovsk, then and Vuhledar, then the way starts to open up for an advance from the east, further south towards Zaporozhye city itself, which the Russians in theory could also push towards from the south, from Melitopol and Mariupol. Now, I only mentioned these two places, Dnipro and Zaporozhye, because a recent article in Strana said that for the Ukrainians, the loss of these two cities, Zaporozhye and Dnipro, would be a terminal blow. And perhaps, as I said, in this complex game of checkers that the Russians are playing in Donbass, we're starting to see that eventuality start to rise over the still rather distant horizon. Just saying. But anyway, let's not move too far ahead of ourselves. Significant advance by the Russians west of Avdiivka, and one can see that it might have significant effects elsewhere on the battlefronts, and all of this alongside significant advances by the Russians in other places through the village of Georgievka in terms of Kurachovo as well. And by the way, there's also been reports that the Russians have been making more advances near Gulyapolye and a place called, if I've got the name correct, Novovasilievka, further south. And it ought to be said that, again, if the Russians were to capture Gulyapolye, which is a largest place, this would be a major battle. And these other places, Novovasilievka, if I've got the name right, that conceivably would also open up a further route to advance towards Zaporozhye, assuming, of course, that that is the Russian plan. Anyway, I don't want to get, as I said, too far ahead. The fact is that the Russians have made a very significant breakthrough in the Avdiivka area. The general tone amongst Russian commentators is optimistic. Things do seem to be going well for them there. And there's also reports that the Russians are now making significant progress further north in the Liman area, and they apparently now have reached, finally, the boundary of the village of Terny on the Zherebets River. Now, again, if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, claims that the Russians had already captured Terny. I remember saying at the time that there'd be no confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry, no confirmation either from the Russian Defense Ministry that another village north of Terny called Makeyevka had been captured. It's clear that both of these villages remain under Ukrainian control, but the Russians do now seem to be, and this appears to be confirmed, at the very outskirts of Terny. It is likely that Terny will be attacked within a few days. It is a small place. It's difficult to see how the Ukrainians can resist for long in Terny. The general consensus is if Terny collapses, then the entire defense line east of the Zherebets River collapses as well. And that then puts the Russians in a strong position to advance towards Liman across the Zherebets River, if that is indeed what they plan to do. Anyway, all of that going on in the north, as well as major battles apparently still underway further north around places like Belogorodka, near Lugansk region. Apparently major battle going on along there. The Russians again seem to be making a major effort to, bombing, hitting, striking at this small town, big village, call it whatever you will. And also the Russians do seem to be making major attacks on Siversk. And of course, if they attack the bombing of Siversk, if Belogorodka falls, it's likely that Siversk will come under attack again from the west and from the south, and from Russian forces pushing up from the back, from Bakhmut and Soledar. And if we go back to Tersky, if that falls, the Russians can move south towards Yampol. They can advance west, as I've said, towards Liman. If they take Yampol, they're in a strong position also to attack Siversk as well. It was the failure, in my opinion, of the Russians to capture Siversk in the summer of 2022, despite Siversk being in a very exposed position even then, that unhinged their defences in the north, making it possible for the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv to achieve so much success. If Siversk is captured along with Yampol and Liman and Terske, then the Russians are in a very strong position indeed, and that will then enable them to push more strongly northwards and westwards, ultimately towards places like Kupiansk and Izium, and that might open a way out for an attack on Slavyansk. Anyway, lots going on there, lots of complex battles. We don't have the whole story, but all sorts of things taking place along the battle lines. Now, it is important, as I say, never to lose the wood for the trees. One of the very interesting points, by the way, that Jacques Beau, the Swiss intelligence officer, who has been one of the most intelligent commentators, one of the most acute and insightful commentators about the war, has been making. He's written recently a fascinating book on the Russian way of war. Anyway, one of the points that Jacques Beau made very early on in that book is that with the Russians, they never get bogged down thinking too much about every individual battle. They never make the mistake of losing sight of the wood for the trees. So they don't spend all their time dwelling too much on battles for relatively small places like Orlovka, for example. There's always an objective, a clearer picture of what lies beyond that. So, as I said, let's not get over-focused on these battles. But, as I said, if you look at a map in Donbass, you could see why that comment that was made a couple of days ago in the London Times, that military observers are starting to think that within a few months, the Russians will be in complete control of Donbass, how that is beginning to look to be true. And to reiterate again, if the Russians are able to take Donbass, complete what they would say is the liberation of Donbass, then the Ukrainian position east of the Dnieper begins to look critical, and the way then opens up for a Russian advance towards Dnipro and arguably towards Zaporozhye as well, and that will be existential for Ukraine. And I strongly suspect that military officials are briefing Western leaders about all of this, and this is what is causing people like Macron and others to panic and to express the alarm and about the events on the battlefronts, and to come up with all these complex and elaborate plans to send troops to Ukraine or Taurus missiles to Ukraine, or to do things of that nature. Anyway, there we go. Now, if we pivot a bit to the political news, we're still in the aftermath of President Putin's overwhelming election victory in the Russian presidential election. And I've discussed in recent programs the really rather sad attempts by Western commentators to argue round the fact of Putin's victory. There was, by the way, a rather grudging article in the Daily Telegraph which appeared yesterday, which conceded a point previously made by Brian Beletic in a video which he did. This article in the Daily Telegraph acknowledged that Putin's electoral victory, 87% of the voters, those who voted, voting for him, is actually fully in line with the latest Levada poll, which puts Putin's approval rating at 86%. This article in the Daily Telegraph, by the way, has, I think, a rather alarming spin on what this means. It basically says that the problem is not just Putin, it's the Russian people, and it throws around words like many people in Russia being evil alongside Putin as well, which I have to say I find most alarming indeed. But anyway, the point is that even as Western governments, Western commentators are in anger and frustration and a degree of grief about the fact that Putin is there to stay, there's now been a procession of leaders who have congratulated Putin on his electoral victory, and several of them have telephoned him to extend to him personal congratulations. Now, the leader of China has, the president of China has President Xi Jinping. He may have telephoned Putin, but we don't have actual confirmation of this. The Kremlin website has provided us no word of that, but the Chinese have straightforwardly congratulated Putin on his electoral victory. Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, however, has telephoned Putin and has extended to Putin his personal congratulations. So has President of Turkey, President Erdogan. So has the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. So has the President of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. So have all of the leaders of the Central Asian states, the former states that make up Soviet Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzia, Tajikistan. They've all called Putin and congratulated him as well. President Aliyev of Azerbaijan has also congratulated Putin. One leader of one country that is still a nominal ally of Russia, Prime Minister Pashinyan of Armenia, he has not called Putin or congratulated him. And in fact, Armenia, under Pashinyan's leadership, and to my knowledge, against the wishes of many of its people, continues to drift away from its historic alliance with Russia. Pashinyan recently received in Yerevan the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. A few weeks ago, the Armenian Parliament ratified the Rome Statute, which in effect means that Putin is unable to travel to Armenia, because if he did, he would, in theory, be arrested there. I can't really see how that would happen, by the way. If he was arrested, what would the Armenians do with him? How would the Russians react? But I'm not going to dwell on this. We've had reports yesterday that Armenian banks are now no longer processing Mir cards, which is going to be a major economic blow for Armenia, by the way, given that Russian travelers and, by the way, the very large Armenian diaspora in Russia use Mir cards. So it's going to be a major blow to the Armenian economy. And there are reports that, I think it was the foreign minister of Armenia, is speaking about Armenia making an application to join the European Union. All of this, even as Azerbaijan continues to make more territorial claims on Armenia, and even as reports have come through that Prime Minister Pashinyan has now conceded to the latest demand for Azerbaijan and is indicating that he's prepared to hand over 4 border villages to Azerbaijani control. Anyway, one way or the other, this is the trajectory that, for the moment at least, Armenia is following. I don't think this is going to end at all well for Armenia, but ultimately the Russians can get by without Armenia. We see that more and more states, I forgot to mention Belarus, all of the other Soviet states that still have good relations with Russia or are nominal allies of Russia, they're all coming and they're all stating that they have also congratulated Putin, and Putin is receiving congratulations from many countries around the world, not just those of the countries whose leaders have telephoned him. So, clear division in the world between the West, increasingly isolated on this question, or so it seems to me, and the global majority, which increasingly welcomes Putin's election. Just saying. Anyway, even as all this is going on, Putin himself has been busy, as he always is, and yesterday he gave a lengthy address to the board of the Federal Security Service, the FSB, Russia's primary internal security agency. He spoke at some length about events on the border. The Ukrainians, over the last 10 days or so, have been launching all kinds of attacks on Russia's border regions, on Belgorod and Kursk region. It's been actually very extraordinary to contrast the way in which parts of the media in the West report these attacks. If you were to follow parts of the British media, you'd almost run away with the impression that significant parts of Belgorod region, for example, have been captured by, well, Ukrainian troops, but of course some parts of the British media still continue to insist that these are rogue Russian troops. Anyway, you get those reports from the British media at least. The Russian media, by contrast, are saying that all of the attacks have been repelled. President Putin yesterday said in his speech to the Special Security Service that all the attacks on Russian territory had been repelled. This morning, we got a statement from the Russian Defense Ministry saying that more Ukrainian attempts to infiltrate into the village of Kozinka, right on the border, have failed as well, and that the Russians have completely cleared all Ukrainian infiltrators from Kozinka. Anyway, the point was that Putin again dropped all kinds of hints about some kind of future Russian operation to establish some kind of buffer zone to protect the border. And it's difficult to see how that won't ultimately extend to an attack on Kharkiv city also. So Putin continues to be busy. He looks to be strongly in charge, and rumors are circulating that at some point over the next couple of days or weeks, he's planning to fly to China and to meet Xi Jinping there. Now, Xi Jinping, for his part, is due to travel to Europe in May, and it's likely that he will try to speak to European leaders, and he will do so, obviously, after having met with Putin, if it is indeed the case that Putin does indeed intend to travel to China at some point over the next few days or weeks. For the record, I think it is highly likely that he will, though I have seen no confirmation of that from any official Russian source. But it seems to me that it would be consistent with the pattern of Sino-Russian relations during the Putin-Xi era if, after winning re-election, Putin were to travel to Beijing. Anyway, the fact that Xi Jinping is due to travel to Europe after meeting with Putin, I think that is going to lead many people to assume that Xi Jinping is going to go to Europe principally to discuss the situation in Ukraine. I don't believe that is the case. I'm sure that the topic of Ukraine will be discussed between Xi Jinping and Putin. I suspect that these two leaders are in regular contact with each other, much more frequently than their respective governments acknowledge. I suspect that Xi Jinping is fully briefed by the Russians about everything that is going on in the fighting in Ukraine, and that he at least has a very clear idea of what it is that the Russians are planning to do. But I suspect that the primary purpose of Putin's trip to China will be to strengthen further economic and political links and to accelerate the process of developing the BRIC states. And Putin, in a very interesting discussion he had yesterday with representatives from members of the Eurasian Economic Union, the economic bloc that the Russians have constructed within the former Soviet Union, one which for the moment still, for the record, includes Armenia. Anyway, Putin said that this economic bloc now needs to work towards the BRICS. In other words, all the members of this economic bloc, Kazakhstan, Belarus, all of those, need increasingly to coordinate their economic policies, and the Eurasian Economic Union as a whole needs to coordinate its integration and economic policies with those of the BRICS and ultimately, I suspect, of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So, I think that is probably the primary purpose of Putin's visit. He's going to want to continue the project of forging deeper economic links with China. There's the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, gas pipeline, that has now been in principle agreed. There's a lot of discussion still to do. Perhaps that will all be wrapped up over the course of this next visit to Beijing. And there's also further economic links. There's been on and off again plans by the Chinese and the Russians to develop some kind of harmonization of their respective aviation industries. The Chinese were very keen at one time to work with the Russians on building a wide-bodied aircraft. I discussed that extensively. I've never heard that this project has been dropped exactly, but since the sanctions war began, the Russians have been placing much more renewed emphasis on rebuilding their own aerospace industry. We have major projects from the Russians to build Tupolev Tu-14 and MS-21, narrow-bodied aircraft and Sukhoi superjet aircraft, all Russianized. These are all existing platforms which the Russians now intend to accelerate production of. And the Russians appear also interested in resuming production of a heavily modernized version of the Ilyushin 96. And they've also got various plans to develop various big engines of their own. The PD-8 and the PD-14, smaller engines, apparently now ready. Plans to begin production, apparently, or rather to work on development of the much bigger PD-35 and PD-50 engines. And recently, Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, spoke about the Russians having successfully managed to reverse engineer the D-18T engine, the big engine that powers the Antonov 124, the big transport aircraft. The D-18T, made by the Mercouris factory in Ukraine. It's been out of production for some years, in fact. But the Russians apparently are intending to put it back in production in Russia itself. A couple of months ago, there were reports that the director of the Mercouris factory had been arrested by the Ukrainian security services for apparently leaking information to the Russians. I wonder whether that what was actually leaked to the Russians were design details of the D-18T. Though, since this was originally a Soviet-designed engine, it is highly likely that the Russians have significant plans for it already, and of course they have D-18Ts already running on existing aircraft, the Antonov 124s, which are already in service with Russia. And the Russians apparently also now planning to place the Antonov 124, the heavy transport Antonov 124, back in production as well. Topic that's been discussed and talked about many times, but apparently now, according to Shoigu, that decision has been made. So we see that the Russians are busy reactivating their aerospace industry. They got extensive plans for that. But maybe plans can be dovetailed with China's in all sorts of ways. And of course, alongside that, we've seen enormous cooperation between the Russians and the Chinese. In car production, probably the Russians will want to tap into Chinese electric car manufacturing technology. They might want to work with the Chinese on silicon chips and those things, especially high-grade, high-end silicon chips. There'll be an awful lot of that discussed between the Chinese and the Russians soon as well. But of course, geostrategic matters will also be discussed by them. The situation in Ukraine, obviously, the relationship with Europe also. Now, it's not been widely reported, but a whole series of Chinese officials have visited Europe recently. Short time ago, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, was in Europe. Li Hui, who is the official, the Chinese official, appointed by the Chinese government to try to promote the ideas for a possible settlement of the Ukrainian conflict that China floated a year ago. Those proposals were very ill received in the West, and the West has not been happy to proceed further with any Chinese plan. But anyway, Li Hui has been active. He's travelled to Russia, travelled to Ukraine. He's apparently trying to travel to Europe. Well, he has been travelling to Europe. He's again made it clear that as far as he's concerned, as far as China's concerned, the Copenhagen process launched by Jake Sullivan back in August of last year to promote Zelensky's peace plan, which, as I've said many times, isn't really a peace plan at all. That is a dead in the water. That China will not attend the forthcoming Copenhagen summit meeting in Switzerland if Russia is not invited. I suspect most states will also stay away. Most other global south or global majority states will also stay away. But I think that when Xi Jinping does go to Europe, he will not say very much about the Ukrainian conflict. The Europeans will try, as they always do, to talk to Xi Jinping about it. Xi Jinping will bat them away. He will simply say to them what he always does, what the Chinese always say, that relations with Russia are not negotiable and they're not open for discussion with third parties. And he will instead try to get the Europeans to think more realistically about their current situation. And on every conceivable measure, the situation is bad. I continue to read articles appearing in the media in the West about how the long-term prospects for Russia's economic development are bleak, cut off as it will now be from Western technology and all that kind of thing. I also read about the demographic problems that Russia is having. None of this seems to acknowledge that on every metric, the situation in Europe especially is actually worse. Russia is seeing an acceleration of its economy. In Europe, we now are looking at contractions and in industry terms, insignificant contractions as well. The demographic situation in Europe also is very bad, with European governments already heavily in debt and with the workforce likely to shrink. That puts European finances on an unsustainable trajectory. Russia, by contrast, has very low debt levels because of a rise in the birth rate a few years ago. There is a substantial cohort of young people about to enter the workforce in Russia, and the Russian government appears to be working to increase, to support families anyway. So it's quite likely that, these sort of things do generally have some effect on the birth rate. It might rise in Russia over the next few years with bigger numbers of young people, support for families, soldiers eventually coming back from the war, especially if the war is victorious. Many of them will probably want to start a family. So it's possible we could see a rise in the birth rate in Russia in the next few years. And besides, if you look at the figures, the birth rate in Russia is already actually slightly a bit higher than it is in most of Europe. And what Xi Jinping is going to try, I think, and explain to the Europeans is, look, your situation really isn't good. You've made a whole series of catastrophic decisions. Do you really want to continue on this path? Do you really want to start sending troops to Ukraine, for example, and getting yourselves into a catastrophic situation with the Russians? Do you really want to jeopardize your long-term economic relationship with us in China too, which is only going to make your situation worse? Isn't it time for you to start to rethink your policies and to start to act in a more realistic way and put aside your anger and start to think constructively about the way forward? I think that is what Xi Jinping is going to try to do. In the face of people like Annalena Baerbock and others, perhaps realistically, he won't get very far. But at least I suppose it's worth trying. Anyway, we will see what comes of all of these moves. As I said, I do expect Putin to travel to China within the next few weeks. Certainly before Xi Jinping goes to Europe, we will see what comes of all of this. Meanwhile, in the United States, it's increasingly looking as if the project, the appropriation, the $61 billion appropriation for Ukraine is well and truly dead in the water. Speaker Johnson, despite intense pressure, is holding to his position. He has the backing, I think, of the majority, a big majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives on that issue. He also has the backing of most of the Republican base. I think Republicans have been even more angered by all the court cases that have been brought against Donald Trump and the fact that Donald Trump might have to make a fire sale of assets to pay the bond on the decision in New York on the supposed inflation of his assets in order to obtain loans. I think Donald Trump's problems on this are going to attract sympathy for him and consolidate support for him even further amongst Republicans or those who are inclined to vote Republicans in the country. There should be alarm signals for the Democrats, with more young people apparently now willing to vote for Donald Trump, and with more people from minority groups in the United States apparently also preparing to vote for Donald Trump. But anyway, for the immediate issue, it seems as if Speaker Johnson now says that he's not prepared to put forward proposals to vote on an appropriation for Ukraine this month to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is due to rise for another break in the first 2 weeks of April. This is pushing this funding proposal package back further and further. There might be parliamentary devices that I don't know about in order to get this proposal to the floor of the House without Speaker Johnson's agreement. But I'm getting the sense that the chances of that are diminishing as well. And it also seems to me that there is a slackening of coverage of Ukrainian war news in the American media also. There's also been some rather concerning articles starting to appear about the overall state of the US economy, with suggestions that the current really unusual policy of combining a very tight monetary policy with high interest rates intended to drain liquidity out of the economy in order to bring down inflation, coupling that with a very lax fiscal policy, piling up budget deficits and debts, which is, of course, increasing liquidity in the economy, that this somewhat contradictory economic policy, which is making the inflation numbers look sticky, and at the same time, which is delivering GDP growth figures, which I think are starting to be less and less widely accepted by the economic observer community. Just saying. I think there's worries in the United States that sometime around midsummer, this whole odd package of policies will start to become unstuck, and that there could be serious problems in the economy, all in the run-up to the election. Anyway, with all of this going on, I do wonder whether the Europeans also are fully alive to the fact that the Americans are becoming more and more absorbed by their own issues, economic and otherwise, are losing interest in Ukraine. Maybe not the team around the president, but the political class taken as a whole, and that in all of the circumstances, this is entirely the wrong moment for the Europeans themselves to dig themselves deeper into Ukraine and to seek a further escalation. Anyway, I think, again, Xi Jinping may, in his own way, careful way, try to point all of that out. But I have to say, I don't see any sign that the Europeans are actually prepared to change course. I think that certainly with respect to Ukraine, and possibly with respect to relations with China, on the contrary, they intend to dig in and become even more antagonistic. We've just had a bizarre statement from the International Olympic Committee, for example, trying to persuade countries not to attend the Russian Friendship Games. Why is that the business of the International Olympic Committee? If athletes from around the world choose to attend these games, that's their business. But anyway, the fact that the IOC, which is based in Europe, is coming up with these statements, I take that as a strong sign that the mood in Europe at the moment, on the part of the political class, is that they're too deeply in to turn back and change course now. So, we are in a trap. The situation in Ukraine deteriorating militarily all the time. We see that Orlovka has fallen with all the various consequences that I outlined. We see that Putin is still there in Moscow. We see that there's likely prospects that the Russians and the Chinese are going to come closer, still closer, over the next few weeks. We see that most of the countries of the global majority are happy that Putin has been re-elected. And by the way, there's even some reports now that oil prices are starting to firm up and might be rising as well, and gas prices also. So, we are in a trap. We don't seem to know what to do. We've come up with dangerous plans to send troops to Ukraine. The Russians, as Medvedev is saying, they basically saying, bring it on. I've never known, not just in my lifetime, but in historical time, a period when European statesmanship has been so completely absent. People talk about the run-up to the First World War, but I have to say that given the invisible men and women who seem to be running things in Europe, invisible but very noisy, even the statesmen who led Europe to disaster in 1914 look like giants. Anyway, that is where I'm going to end my programme today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, shirts. We have a 15% discount on shirts at the moment. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.